question was, when coding sequela versus personal history, do I code sequela whenever I see due to, and will the physician's note say personal history of for when I need to code a history? Well, I'll tell you what, they're not necessarily going to, they may or may not put personal history. So I don't want to confuse you and say, oh, yep, they'll always say personal history or family history. But there is a place on the note that you can go look at when they use the encoders, not the encoders, but the program. And there is a place for personal history, family history. So that would be divided. And most likely that part would be filled out there, family history of cardiovascular disease, or they may have a personal history of breast cancer. So again, it could be there in that section. Now, when they type that into the encounter, if it's a new event that they're recording, then it'll be in kind of the meat of the body, and they'll usually say patient has a personal history of cancer, but you have to be very careful, because sometimes our providers like to at the beginning kind of give a rundown of what they're going to be dealing with the patient, and they'll say, our patient has a history of hypertension, hyperlipidemia, diabetes, and prostate cancer. Well, they may be saying that, yes, they have a personal history of prostate cancer, but everything else is just a laundry list of what the patient has, because you don't get rid of diabetes per se, or even hypertension and hyperlipidemia. And therefore, what you want to do is make sure that you're paying attention to not only what's listed, but all the other information that is there on the encounter. So regarding this question here, the confusion is sequela versus personal history, but they're actually two completely different things. And I think the person knows that, but they're wanting to know how to abstract that. When I look at the documentation, how do I verify a sequela, a late effect, versus a personal history? A personal history means the person had a disease or disease process that no longer exists. Whereas sequela means it's active. The patient has a late effect of something. So that would be or residual is sometimes used in addition. So let's look at the two examples that I pulled up. If a person has a stroke, then that person in the acute phase is in the hospital, right? And when they're released from the hospital, wherever they're released to, they may or may not have a residual or a late effect or a sequela from the stroke. Now, when we think about what a stroke actually is, it can be caused by more than one thing, but usually it's either a bleed in the brain or a blockage and the blood vessels. So oxygenated blood is not getting to that part of the brain, and depending on where the stroke is would determine what type of residual or late effect would be from that particular lack of oxygen. Now, sometimes there's none, which that's not very often, but they could get treatment right away and not have any late effect. Or a lot of the times they do. And one of the late effects that's common is to have hemiplegia or hemiparesis, meaning one side, hemi or half of the body is paralyzed or weakened because that other side of the brain from the bleed is not, the side that the bleed is on, or the lack of oxygen, affects the opposite side of the body. So if you have a bleed or a stroke on the right side, the left side will be affected and vice versa if you're going to have that type of paralysis. Okay, that all being said, let's say that our patient has a left side stroke, has some hemiparesis. After they get ready to be discharged and are discharged, they no longer have an active stroke. That code isn't used anymore. It's now we need to tell what happened. Well, they either have a history of a stroke with no residuals, or they have a late effect or sequela. And the sequela I picked was I69.351, hemiplegia or hemiparesis, so weakness, following the stroke, affecting the right side, which is dominant. Okay, and that's what those codes need to know, is which side is affected, and is that the patient's dominant side or not. So I picked right side weakness, and that right side is the dominant side for the patient. I69.351. This is a sequela code, or a late effect, or a residual. Okay, and it's not a personal history code. You're not coding that the patient, well, you are coding that the patient has a history of a stroke, but the verbiage is that the patient had a stroke, now they have a sequela. Whereas if the person does not have any residual or sequela or late effect, then that's a true personal history, meaning nothing is active for the stroke anymore. That's what her personal history means. It would be Z86.73, personal history of a TIA or cerebral infarction without residual deficit. And that also could state personal history of prolonged reversible ischemic neurological deficit, or personal history of stroke not otherwise specified without residual deficits. Okay, personal history, you have no long-term effect from that. Sequela, they've had a stroke, and now they have a new diagnosis, or something else is left over due to the stroke. Okay.
Do you need more medical certification and business training? Learn more at www.cco.us.